Alright, so we are going to start here with our first art piece. This is going to be an abstract watercolor painting, and you can think of this as a warm up exercise. We're just going to practice here our brush strokes and how to hold the brush and how to create these simple shapes. So basically, what we're trying to accomplish here is to become acquainted with the watercolor paint, with the brush, with the paper, and create those shapes organically with the help of the brush. We're not doing much with these shapes, we're just letting the brush create the shapes for us. And the type of the brush that I'm using here is called long round brush. This is a very useful watercolor brush that I highly recommend to have. You don't need to have too many types of brushes, but this is definitely the most useful. The watercolor paint that I'm using here is called Fine Touch. This is a student grade watercolor paint from Hobby Lobby. It is very affordable, and in my opinion, it works just well. I'm not being sponsored by the brand. I paid for all these supplies that I'm showing here, but I think this watercolor paint is good for beginners. The only difference between a professional artist watercolor paint and a student grade watercolor paint is just the amount of pigment. Professional artist watercolor paint has a lot more pigment than a student grade watercolor paint. But as you can see here, these colors look very nice, so no need to spend a lot of money on expensive paint when we're starting out on practicing a new medium. Anyway, this abstract watercolor paint I'm creating here is an excellent exercise for beginners because it's very repetitive without being boring. Basically, we're just exercising how to use the brush and control the water, while at the same time we're creating a very pretty art piece. The color I chose for this abstract paint is the cerulean blue, but you can use any color you like. So after I was done creating those shapes with the blue color, I decided to add more shapes with a smaller brush, and for that I used my metallic watercolor paint. So this one too is a very affordable watercolor paint. When starting with watercolor paint, it's also important to consider the paper. I highly recommend to use watercolor paper. It is possible to do some artwork on mixed medium paper, but I really don't advise to use mixed media for watercolor. It is best to use paper that is specific to watercolor because they can hold a huge amount of water. Also, if you are looking for some kind of relaxation, this type of abstract artwork is ideal. It's not a complicated image, you don't have to add a lot of details. So, this type of art is relaxing. I think sometimes when you have a bad day and you need to take your mind away from things that are upsetting you, creating this kind of simple artwork will help you relax and relieve some stress. Okay, so here is how this abstract piece would look like if you were to make it big and hang it on your wall. I think it looks very pretty. Well, I hope you get to try this one. So I hope that by now you're starting to feel a little more confident and maybe ready for something more challenging. Because what we're going to do now is to just lightly sketch some teacups stacked on top of each other. They don't need to look perfect, they don't need to look extremely symmetrical. In fact, if they look a little bit crooked and wonky, your artwork is going to have a whimsy and playful vibe. With this art piece, we are also going to work with repetition. That's because all the teacups are going to be the same color and we're going to paint them with the same technique. So first, I'm going to add the water on the paper, and then while the paper is still wet, I'm going to add the paint. I'm going to use three colors: yellow, peach, and red. And I add the paint from the lightest color to the darkest, and then I blend them together. And at some point, I just let the water do some of the job. That is a really fun part of the process. So this is a really good exercise because here we are learning how to blend the colors, and we're also repeating this process a few times, which help us practice these techniques. So as you can see here, I painted the first cup and then I skipped to the third one in the middle. That is because I don't want to apply wet paint or water into paint that is still wet from the first cup, because that will make a big mess. So that's why I skipped to the third one in the middle, and I'm going to give time for that first one to dry before I paint the second one. So I chose teacups for this artwork because I really love teacups and teapots and dishes and china of all kinds. But you can choose any subject that you like, and just make it repetitive. Other simple subjects that are easy to sketch could be oranges, apples, or objects that are somewhat round and simple are always good subjects for beginners who are just starting on watercolor paint. Something to consider about watercolors is that in the beginning of your artwork, you might feel that it looks kind of ugly and you might feel discouraged and not want to continue. That happens quite often. But one thing to remember is that we have to trust the process. All art pieces are going to have an ugly phase, and that's okay. Keep going, keep pushing, keep painting, and eventually your artwork is going to look beautiful. But we need to cross that obstacle of having an ugly face in our artwork before we get to our beautiful final piece. So right now, this artwork is looking a little bit ugly, really. It just looks like it doesn't have much potential, but don't feel discouraged, just keep painting. Another tip that I like to give to beginners is that you should start with smaller projects. It is best to beginners not to jump directly into a very large piece of artwork. They are more difficult, they're much more challenging, they require a lot more work into it. And if you're not able to finish your artwork, or if it just becomes too overwhelming, you might just end up giving up on the learning process altogether. So if you're in the beginning of your journey to learn watercolors, or any kind of medium for that matter, I recommend to start with small projects like this one. This is a small sketchbook, and all the projects that I have in this video today are small and very achievable for beginners. Also, this piece is going to be more of a watercolor mixed media because later I am going to use watercolor pencils and add some touch up on this artwork with the watercolor pencils. I am also going to use some fine liners and acrylic pens to decorate the teacups. So, this is not necessarily a traditional watercolor artwork, it is a mixed media watercolor. It is still really pretty and gives you the opportunity to practice your watercolor skills, your watercolor techniques while having fun, while enjoying the process. And then in the end, you have a very pretty art piece. I am using here Faber-Castell watercolor pencils. You can use any watercolor pencils you have at home. You don't have to buy anything expensive. Although, if you want a lot of pigment on your artwork, then I recommend the Faber-Castell or Prismacolor watercolor pencils. So, what I'm doing here is just adding these touch-ups on this watercolor paint just to enhance the vibrancy of the colors. And I am not going to add any water this time. I'm just going to leave the watercolor pencils dry in this paint. But if you want, you can add an extra layer of water and play with the water just a little more. I really like the extra texture of the watercolor pencils in the watercolor art. But if you prefer the transparency of the watercolor paint, then don't add any watercolor pencils. Just leave it as the paint by itself. Watercolor pencils and regular color pencils are one of my favorite mediums, so it is really no effort for me to use them in my art. I really like them. But remember that it's very important to keep your pencils very sharp because they work better that way. So, to make a beginner friendly drawing, I made the decorations very simple, just lines and circles. You could also use polka dots and flowers or anything that you like to decorate these teacups. One thing to remember is to wait for your watercolor paint to dry completely before you use your fine liner over your watercolor paint. This is very important, and I wish I knew that when I first started painting with watercolor and adding fine liners over it. I have ruined so many of my Pigma micron pens, and these pens are not cheap, and many of them got damaged for being used when the paper was not 100% dry. So the thing is, sometimes the paper looks dry or feels dry to the touch, but the under layers of the paper might not be very dry, and the humidity gets into your fine liner and they're just not good anymore. So wait a couple of days or more if you live in an area that is humid before you use your fine liners over your watercolor paint. And here is how these teacups art would look like as a large print. I really like how they came out. Okay, so the next art piece is going to be some cayenne peppers. These are very easy to sketch. So just look online for a photograph of any kind of peppers or even any kind of vegetables that you feel are very easy to draw, and just loosely sketch them on your sketchbook or on your watercolor paper. You can use fine liners to add some ink to your pencil sketch, just like I'm doing here. But you could also skip this step and leave just the pencil sketch. If you use your ink pen, you can add some shade to your drawing too. I really love to add shading to my ink drawings, so that is not an effort for me at all. But you can also skip that step. Now, the concept of this artwork is going to be the same as the other ones, as being a little bit repetitive without being boring. That's because we're going to paint the same thing a few times, and with that, we get to practice our painting skills, our brush strokes, and our control of water and pigment. So I'm going to use a very bright tone of red for these cayenne peppers. And I always leave a portion of the subject, in this case the pepper, blank or white, like with no color at all. That is because I want to represent the light in the subject, in this case, in these peppers. So I am imagining that there is a light source coming from the left side of this image, and so the top of those peppers are lighter on that area and darker on the other side. So I'm going to let them dry, and then I'm going to come back again with more paint, and I'm going to add a darker tone of red on the right side of these peppers to represent the shadows or the shade in this subject. That is a skill that is very important that we master in the beginning of our journey in any kind of medium, in art in general, is to understand value, meaning light, shade, and shadows. I hope this video inspires you to create something of your own, and especially I hope you enjoy this process, because that is the most important part of this whole thing. We are here to enjoy the creative process. And one of the mistakes that I see the beginners make is getting too caught up into the techniques and obsess over supplies. What exact color to use and what kind of pen it's best for the drawing and little things like that. And I think getting caught up in these details and trying to make art something perfect, it's what removes all the enjoyment of the process of painting or drawing or any kind of art. So just remember, just grab your supplies and start creating art without being so concerned about these little things and the perfection, and just don't worry about it and get started. Once you start, you take the first step, and then the creativity will just flow naturally. Eventually, these skills start building up. I know this is easier said than done. I myself I have made many of these mistakes in the beginning of my journey, and only when I decided to relax and just have fun with the process, not trying to be perfect, was when I started to have more fun painting and drawing. So remember, the most important part of doing art is the enjoyment you get from it. So here is how our cayenne peppers would look like if they were printed in a large canvas. Okay, so for our final watercolor exercise today, we're going to start by adding some water on our paper. I'm using here a peach light color, but you can use any color that you want, such as a light yellow or pink or any light color that you like. And then now I'm drawing some leaves. I chose these monstera leaves. They are a little more challenging because they have these cuts on their wedges. So if you don't want to draw something like this, you can draw just simple leaves, any kind of shape that it's easy for you. So as you can see here, I am using ink over the pencil lines. And remember, as I mentioned before, it's very important to let the watercolor dry for a couple of days before we come in with the ink. Otherwise, we're going to damage our ink pens. So after tracing the pencil lines with the ink, I am going to use watercolor pencils. I'm using here again the Faber-Castell watercolor pencils, and my palette here is a combination of yellow, teal, and a deep tone of blue. So one side of the leaves I colored in yellow, and then in the middle I blended in with the teal, and on the other side, to make it darker, I used the deep tone of blue and blended again with the teal that is in the middle. So we're creating some light and shade effects here with our watercolor pencils. And then now I'm going to use here a water brush. These are very convenient because they already have water in their little reservoir. So you don't have to use the brush and dip the brush in the water. You are now activating the pigment of the watercolor pencils with this water brush, starting from the lightest color to the darkest. So let's do here again this on another leaf. I am adding the water into the yellow parts of the leaf and then blending in with the teal color and then bringing in the darkest color, which is the blue, and blending in again with the teal. It's a very fun process because here there are many leaves and this drawing is again repetitive. So we are practicing our skills while having fun. So you don't need to use this water brush. You can use any kind of regular brush if you don't have these ones. But if you do have, I think those are very convenient and very easy to use. So I recommend it to try this one. So after the leaves were dry, I added a light tone of brown and burgundy under the leaves to create some shadows on that surface. And then added some more water and blended everything again. So we're almost done today with this tutorial. I hope you have enjoyed this video, and if you have not subscribed yet, please subscribe. It would help my channel immensely so I can keep creating these videos. So let me know in the comments which one of these easy watercolor projects you like the most and which one you want to try. And here is our final art piece. if it was printed on a large canvas. If you like to see more of my creative process, please watch this next video coming up, and I will see you next time. Bye bye.